Es un enorme gusto y será un enorme placer escuchar la conferencia o el conversatorio, más bien como está anunciado, de la profesora Helga Varden. Ella es de origen noruego, estudió en Canadá, en la Universidad de Toronto, y ahora es profesora, full professor, bueno, gracias. Y ahora es profesora en la Universidad de Illinois, en Urbana-Champaign. Y bueno, estamos muy contentos de que esté aquí. Vino con el pretexto de la bienal, de la reunión bianual de la Sociedad Kantiana Norteamericana, que va a empezar el día de mañana y a la cual también están todos y todas invitados. Ella tiene un trabajo muy interesante en una parte, digamos, de filosofía moral de Kant, entre otras cosas. Tiene un libro reciente del 2020, si no me equivoco, sobre el amor, el sexo en Immanuel Kant, publicado por la prensa universitaria de Oxford. Aunque no lo crean, sí hay un tópico en Kant, el sexo y el amor y todo eso. Y su libro es muy bueno, si quieren aprender cosas importantes e interesantes de eso, de ese tema raro en Kant, que no es la deducción trascendental o otras cosas. Les recomiendo mucho su libro. También tiene un trabajo muy interesante sobre trauma, y no les voy a quitar más tiempo y los voy a dejar con Helga Varden hablando sobre Kant y la interseccionalidad. Gracias por venir. It's all yours.
Thank you. And whatever he said. Thank you for the generous introduction, though I have no idea what you just said. But I did recognize a few words in it. So hopefully what I say will be consistent with what you just said, but maybe not, who knows. Anyway, it is so lovely to be here, and I've had the most wonderful time so far, talked an enormous amount of philosophy, seen fantastically beautiful things, and eaten amazing food. So thank you for having me here, and thank you for coming here to talk about and think about intersectionality with me. I think one of the things Professor Lazarus was saying was that not so long ago I wrote a book on sex, love and gender and a Kantian theory, and if he said that, that's true. And it is a book that tries to fix Kant, or the Kantian theory on sex, love and gender. One does not have to be very radical. There are almost no exceptions on the planet, people walking the planet, but almost all people who do know philosophy and know Kant agree that when it came to sex, love and gender, it was not very good. Okay? It was not one of those, oh yeah, we're so proud to be Kantians, because look at what he wrote about sex, love and gender. So a lot of that book then was trying to find out what Kantians could say about sex, love and gender, use a lot of the resources available in Kant's philosophy, figuring out why it was the case that he said what he said, so sort of trying to figure out the stream of consciousness, and thinking it's important, actually, to try and figure out why he said what he said, because, and now I'm going to be a little bit radical, because understanding how somebody that brilliant, who came up with these amazing freedom theories, could get something that basic so very wrong, is probably quite important if we want to do better as academics. So another way of saying it, a temptation probably as academics is to think that when people say something very bad, some brilliant mind, oh, that was just a mistake. I don't think that's true. So one way to, again, being a little bit provocative, it's supposed to become a conversation. So let me be a bit provocative. If it had been the case that it was that easy to improve things in the world, I don't think we would live in quite a sexist, racist, heterosexist, etc., classist, whatever world. We would probably live in a different world. Because it's not the case, including with Kant's own theories of freedom, that it's not very difficult to say that all those isms are wrong. And they involve profound wrongdoing. So if it was that easy to fix it, we would have inherited a different world. And we are not. So that book, though, Sex, Love and Gender, is a book really on sex, love and gender, and it's putting to aside a lot of topics. And one reason why it put away to the side some of those topics was because I am born, I think was said too, in Norway. I look like this, right? And by the time I was born, which was in 1970s, and now you know how old I am. So Norway had found oil. And so it was crawling out of the period after the World War II, where pretty much everything was destroyed. And there was just poverty for a very long time. And there came the oil, and at the same time, very strong labor movements, and we got a welfare state. And so I was on that first generation, where people could start to get a higher education independent of parents' wealth. So, but still, I am then in part in this room right now, right? Because I did happen to be born there at that particular time. It would not have been possible if you were my parents, right? And it's not possible many places where there were oil. It just happened to be true that it was possible there. But it's also the case that then I traveled the world with having this oil country behind me. And so I got to travel to many places and get an education. So that's one reason why I'm here. But as you also might see, I look like this, which means I travel the world with white privilege. And I live in the US, right? And I live in the US without knowing the US, having grown up there. So, but I travel and live in the US looking like this. And that means, for me anyway, that it was very difficult to do some of the isms, and especially racism. Because I write in a country where I didn't grow up, I look like this, and racism, black racism in the US is enormous. And it's been with the US from the beginning. And so it wasn't easy for me to figure out how on earth even to address it, or for that matter, to understand it well enough to even figure out how to tell the story. Let me put it differently. It was not so difficult for me to write sex, love, and gender in many ways, because I am a woman who's married to a woman. And so I know a lot of that life. And I also run an organization called the Society for Philosophy of Sex and Love. So I've listened for 10 years to those who are in the LGBTQIA community, but not exactly my experience. So I felt like I can say a lot of stuff there without thereby doing harm, because I don't know what I'm talking about. And that was very important to me, but it also was important for not try to talk to, among other things, race and racism or racialization as part of that book, because I just wasn't ready to do it. So this talk today, usually I give it in the US context, and then I start often with this slide, because intersectionality is very much a concept and an idea that we have thanks to Kimberly Crenshaw, who is an incredible thinker who started, or some of her important work, including this essay where we find this phrase of intersectionality. She did it in part by studying these brilliant black women. This one's Sojourner Truth, who was and lived a lot of her life in slavery, and then escaped it, and ultimately slavery was ended during her lifetime. But then also the next generation black women, and Anna Cooper is one of them. So liberation came when she was about 7. So in Sojourner Truth grew up and lived a lot of her life as a slave in the US, she was the next generation. Okay? And so if you have heard more about men, famous men, black men, then she is a contemporary of Frederick Douglass, whereas Anna Cooper is a contemporary of Du Bois. But perhaps because sexism is real, I'm just suggesting it provocatively, you might more likely have heard about Frederick Douglass and Du Bois than you have about these two brilliant women. Yes? So, often in the US, I show people this speech by Truth, Aren't I a Woman? And there's a few versions of it, but it's very, very amazing speech. So she's basically in a room of activists. It's all about getting the right to vote. A lot of white women, a lot of black men in the room. And she is this phenomenal black woman who has an amazing philosophical mind, also an incredible ability to argue on the spot, and for that matter, sing. So she takes the word in this setting after she's listened to the black men and the white women, and she gives a speech defending the right for black women and taking on the white women for their racism and taking on the men for their sexism. So I often start with that because that was one of the very important texts that Kimberly Crenshaw used when she tried to figure out how to understand the kinds of forces, intersectional, more than one, forces coming out at black women, namely both racism and sexism. And then I also usually, a little bit because of technology today, I'm not going to do the speech. Or do you want to see that speech? Shall we try and find it? Or would you like to hear it? To have heard it? It is brilliant. There are two versions. I'll do the historically more correct one, yeah? But when you come home, you should also listen to Francis Gage's version, but as it's delivered by Alice Walker, because it's unbelievable. But it isn't as historically correct as this one. Okay, so we'll do that one. Let's see if I can work it here. If I can do this, then please be a little bit impressed. Because I'm not good at this. Let's see.
May I say a few words? I want to say a few words about this matter. I am a woman's right. I have as much muscle as any man, and I can do as much work as any man. I have plowed and reaped and husked and chopped and mowed. And can any man do better than that? I have heard much about the sexes being equal. I can carry as much as any man, and I can eat as much too, if I can get it. I am as strong as any man that is today. As for intellect, all I can say is if a woman have a pint and a man a quart, why can't she have her little pint full? You need not be afraid to give us our rights, for fear we will take too much. For we can't take much more than a pint will hold. The poor men seem to be all in confusion, and they don't know what to do. Why, children, if you have woman's rights, give it to her, and you will feel better. You have your own rights, and there won't be so much trouble. I can't read, but I can hear, and I have heard the Bible, and learned that Eve caused man to sin. But if woman upset the world, to give her a chance to set it right side up again. The lady has spoken about Jesus, how he never spurned woman from him, and she was right. When Lazarus died, Mary and Martha came to him with faith and love and besought him to raise their brother. And Jesus wept, and Lazarus came forth. And how came Jesus into the world? Through God who created him, and woman who bore him. Man, where is your part? But women are coming up. Blessed be God, and a few of the men are coming up with him. But man is in a tight place. The poor slave is on him, the women are coming on him, and he is surely between a hart and a buzzard.
In 1851, the black abolitionist
This is the
and
trouble,
former slave Sojourner Truth spoke to a gathering of feminists in Akron, Ohio. The spontaneous speech, only a few minutes long, was a landmark moment in feminist and abolitionist history.
Indeed. Okay. So I did do that. Were you a little bit impressed that I could almost do it quite well? I did find it quite hard. Anyway, in addition to Sojourner Truth then, so part of what she's doing in that one, and for those of you who have read the paper, which might be some of you, you see that I draw attention to some of the things she does there, which is quite typical for a lot of people who argue against their oppressors. She calls them on it, she draws attention to how they know better, and then she out-argues them. And if you can out-argue them, then it clearly isn't true that you can't argue, is it? So in a certain sense, you just show by what you're doing what the claim is that you cannot do. And in these conditions, as you know, if we put you all on the spot now, and we all are making noise to you, making it difficult for you, and we are all arguing that you don't have what it takes, if you can argue under those circumstances, you certainly has shown that you can argue. And it often is the case that you will see in these early voices what they do. It's the same for Anna Cooper. Anna Cooper, she takes on a whole room full of black male ministers. And she takes on the Christian church for how they interpret the role of the women. She takes on their hypocrisy. And she argues, among other things, against the view that was very common at the time, and a little bit famously so, held by a lot of black men, namely that, once they can enter the power spaces, then the whole black race can enter with them. And she says she's about, I think, 24 at this point, but no more. She's just finished her undergrad. There's a whole room full of black ministers, men. And this famous line that you also find in this famous paper is, only the black woman can say, when and where I enter, in the quiet, undisputed dignity of my womanhood, without violence, without suing or special patronage, then and there the whole Negro race enters with me. In other words, she's also drawing attention to how it is the case that they live subjected to two types of forces, namely racism and sexism, which makes it enormously much more difficult for them to actually enter the spaces. And just because black men can enter it does not thereby mean that black women can enter. So that was the origin, or some of the original thoughts that motivated Crenshaw's concept of intersectionality, and which by now has kind of changed academia in many ways, because a lot of us want to be able to understand and keep working on the theory of intersectionality. I think I'm supposed to ask at 20 minutes if there are any questions. Are there any questions so far?
Preguntas, comentarios, inquietudes.
Or are we all right? Yeah? You were thinking.
No, yeah.
Okay, cool. Okay. So that's some of the background, yeah? I'm coming from this place. I'm trying to now enter into this whole complexity of intersectionality, trying to find a way to tell the story. And as you will see here, or if you read the paper, I'm trying to find a way also to tell the story without telling it in my voice. Yes? That's part of the challenge. How can you find a way to give voice to those nobody listened to, and who should be telling the story and should have been part of the conversation the whole time? And, yeah?
Can I interrupt?
Yes.
Gracias. So, in my understanding, the concept of intersectionality comes from legal or juridical contexts.
In a way.
Crenshaw, I saw once a conference where she told the story of the concept, and it comes from a case of a woman worker who was black, and he tried to sue she was asking for a job, right? And she didn't get the job, and she tried and sue the employer because of wrong handling of the process.
Yes.
And the court said that well, you can't sue because you're a woman and black. No? You can sue because you're a woman, or you can sue because you're black.
Yeah.
Something like that. But you can't sue because you're black and a woman.
Yeah.
So this is like the origin of that. Just a little question. How do you think, because you just said it has like overflown the original, and it's everywhere in academia. So my question is, does the original legal context prevail in the rest of the discussions?
No.
Or, okay.
I would say no. Not that it isn't important also in the legal context, but I would argue it's way overflown, those boundaries of the legal case. Part of what, as we'll come back to a little bit later too, the legal case was part of what motivated her, because she was a legal scholar. And she was like, this case is so fantastic. We have a whole legal system. It could deal with racism, or it can deal with sexism. You can make a case that you're being oppressed or wronged, but you can't make it if you have both. And it's like, whoa. Another way of saying it, maybe it's a bit nice to the philosophers, but she has a bit of a philosophical spirit in her too, right? So she didn't just say, hey, all legal scholars, we need also to allow cases where they involves two. Instead, she goes back to these incredible women, and she starts trying to think about it, but also by rereading them, and then you see that they already are thinking about it. And so she's starting, I think, the development of trying to find a theory for wherever you are in the world, whether it is philosophy, but also it can be sociology, it can history. You can use it in so very, very many ways. And I think part of how, well, I would be happy if you disagree to talk about that. I think part of where you want to take it depends a little bit on what it is that you're doing. And my heart is in philosophy, so I'm trying to figure out intersectionality as a philosophical tool and theory. That's what I'm after. And there's certain kinds of puzzles that don't actually quite arise. And I'll probably talk more about it today. But this original version of it too has a certain type of approach that I don't think we're going to is the one that we want to defend in the end. And it goes something like this. You have racism, and then you have sexism. And so you are living subject to two forces, right, that intersect. And it makes it much harder for you. But I think actually living subjected to racism and sexism as a black woman does, for example, it's that the sum is more than the two elements. And so philosophically, you want to explain why it's not just that you have to deal with sexism and racism, but somehow you have to deal with a lot more. So the sum is bigger than the parts, and that's, I think, part of the challenge. What is it about us, philosophically, such that that is the case? Any other questions there? Okay, then I'll go on a little bit and try and get good old Manny, Immanuel Kant, on the floor too. Okay? So Kant was infamously sexist, racist, heterosexist, and for a long time nobody talked about that. I think it's pretty much true. Probably exaggerated, but it's totally nice to give the credit to Charles Mills for having started the work to do something about this as Kant scholars. Kant scholars, when they read these horrendous statements of Kant's, usually just said, oh, that was just like a bad day. We just don't read that stuff. We just read the freedom things, or we read the first critique. We don't talk about that stuff. That's just embarrassing anyway. Right? And so I'm one of those, like Charles Mills, who thinks that, like I hinted at before, I don't think it's that easy. And I do think that Kantians have a bigger responsibility than many for doing something about it, both in Kant but also in general, because Kantianism is very influential in the profession, but also in the world. So Kant was the one, if you ever use the word dignity, right, or you want freedom theories, Kant is kind of your guy, If you want a very, very, very good theory, that's the thing. And he was revolutionary in all kinds of ways. Like he contrasts to all the other ones, even those who had some of this stuff going on, like Locke. Kant turned it all around. So rather than having the right to self-preservation on the basis of his theory, he meant the right to freedom. And what was the point about the right to freedom is the opposite of slavery. And then he made a giant theory, moral theory, of freedom like that. In other words, it's a very, very good theory. So the challenge then, there are two challenges in it. One is like, how come he also was sexist, racist, and heterosexist? That's one part of the challenge. Where did it come from? But also, how do we do it better? Like, exactly how do we do it better? Should we just actually do a little bit what the others did, which was to chop off all the other stuff? All the stuff that isn't freedom. So once he starts talking about human nature and animality and how we are social beings, social embodiment, all that stuff, we would just chop that off and we just do freedom. And I am fairly convinced that that won't help, let alone if you want to have a theory of intersectionality. It's just not good enough. What you end up with is a theory that doesn't do what you need it to be able to do. So I don't think that's an option. So, very short, I'm not going to talk about this unless you ask me questions for now. I think what he didn't do wrong was, and so what I'm defending and I have to talk a lot about, is that I think he's right, that when it comes to principles of freedom and rights, they have a kind of objectivity that is very special, and I defend it, and I think it's right. Okay? I think we have, for example, a right to bodily integrity. So if you were raped 200 years ago, before we had the language and concept of a right to bodily integrity, I think you were wronged also then. I don't think like a right to bodily integrity is a sort of a modern invention. It's the way in which we formulate it is, but the wrongdoing was always there. So part of what it is that I don't want to give up any of the freedom stuff that he's defending. Also, I want to defend in general that once you move from the freedom stuff in Kant and down to how we're embodied social beings, you move down to a sphere that is much more contingent, which means that it's where diversity lives. We are not the same in all these ways. And some of the challenge for theory is to figure out how come there are patterns about that and how come we're not all the same. For those of you who have done a ton of stuff, just to give you a hint, is I don't believe, for example, that sexuality, such as sexual orientation, is constructed all the way down. I think that's not true. I do believe race is constructed all the way down. So one reason why I don't want to give up some of the layers and all the stuff is that I believe it's wrong. Those who argue that when they say something about oppression and it's all bad, and then they say, for example, sex and race. I think in many instances you can't use them interchangeably. Because another way of saying it, I don't know you yet, so I have to sort of read faces to see if I'm losing you or not. But I believe the metaphysics of race is different from the metaphysics of sex and gender. Okay? I think some people are really pretty gay. And I think some people are really pretty straight.
There's probably a question there. ¿Quieres hacer una pregunta, compañero?
No, ahorita más adelante.
Okay. Yeah, just in time.
So, in a minute. Just let me understand this, and I will tell you, because I'm sorry I'm interrupting. Sorry.
No, es una conversación.
We were talking with my friend, and in the class that we recognize that Kant. No, así es un minuto porque.
Sí.
We recognize that Kant realized himself that he has like these contingent concepts in his philosophy. So as I was talking with him, as you said, race, sex, and gender is like the kind of practice thing, just like very, very practice. And the other metaphysics you were talking is like the theoric one. It's not, we cannot put the same boundaries, limits on race, sex, and gender, and the most theoretical things you can think. You know?
I think so.
Yeah. So
I'll repeat it back to you in a little bit, and then we'll see. But
okay.
Yeah.
That's it.
And yes. So, if I understood you correctly, it's exactly what I mean. But also in terms of lived human lives. So, here's one way to say it. So, one of my first philosophical loves was Simone de Beauvoir. And she's existentialist, right? And she has a version of constructivism all the way down. It's just choice all the way down.
Yeah.
And I thought, yeah, exactly. I am married to a woman, but I am bisexual, as she is. And I was like, who in their right mind wouldn't want all the fun? Who in their right mind would have half of the fun? That makes no sense to me. And so I was so sure she was right. Like, nobody wants half of it. Like, then you don't know how fun it is. And then I realized that's wrong, actually. That's just a contingent fact.
Yeah, that's what we were talking.
Yes. So I got her, and I found, yeah, that's the right theory. But that was universalizing my way,
Yeah.
right? But it also matters enormously much, of course, once you try. So Simone de Beauvoir, super important and amazing and brilliant. But I think this part of the theory is wrong. Similarly, very influenced by Simone de Beauvoir is Judith Butler, right? Who's also constructivist all the way down. She recognizes now it's all performances. And you think, when in those theories, you think that the only alternative to choice of construction or performance all the way down is an essence, and which I think is also wrong. But it seems like they had that option. Either you have to have construction choice or something performance all the way down, or you end up with an essence theory, right? There's sort of some mystical essence floating somewhere, right? Which is not convincing. And so, and she recognizes that now, Butler, that when it came, the problem, and also for me, the wake-up call. I didn't have the wake-up call on straight people or gay people. I didn't quite. But I did when I had a student who's trans. And that student said to me, so, what about me? And it's like, yeah, the theory is wrong. Definitely. And Judith Butler agrees today, right? So that, yeah, a gender trope will say, or that theory is not good when it comes to trans. That is, it's good to some trans experiences, namely those who are that are very fluid. But here's the one for me, super important, that you have to be able to explain, is people for whom it is existentially important to be able to transition. Mm-hmm. That's what you want to explain. And then if you go to, you know, anything in your DNA, if you go to just choice all the way down, you have nothing to work with. You can't get to it. But you want to somehow have a theory that shows that it's existentially real for how it is that you are. And so once they transition, they have expressions like, I can finally be who I always experienced myself to be. And that's what the account has to do, to explain that. And so, long story short, in the book I argue Kant actually has the moves, which is nice.
I'm not getting it. If what you're saying is that what we have available is either you are a constructionist all the way down or an essentialist. And I don't know what you're trying to say, that you're none of those, because I don't think those are the only two things. And I don't think you have to be a realist in the sense of there being something which on top, but that the way socialization materializes itself becomes, that's reality. So it's not, I don't know if I'm making myself clear, but it's a sort of constructionism all the way down, but it materializes and then it becomes reality. And we read reality this way, and that's why we think it is the way reality is. But actually reality has a lot to do with how we live on it and how we think about it and how we, so I don't know if I'm making myself clear, but what I'm trying to say is that you can be a constructionist all the way down and still be a materialist, which is a realist or something like that. Yes. That's one thing. And the other thing I wanted to say is that when just a moment ago you said that you were trying not to tell the story yourself, but you were trying to tell it by letting other people talk, and because it's sort of their story, even if it's all our stories, because we're living in this world and we share this world, and their story is our story in many important ways. Yes. Because it makes us also blind. And if we don't somehow recognize that and make it ours, then we will keep doing the same thing just by letting them talk. So when we give them the words, in a sense, I think that we're like, it can be read as we're doing them a favor, instead of somehow making it, we're not talking for them instead of them, but we're talking from our perspective by trying to listen to what they are saying. I don't know if...
Absolutely. Yeah. Exactly. Okay. The only place we probably is the first one, but now I'm turning this because of me, because it's so easy, because I just finished the book on that. We're talking it very easily into a sex and love talk, and we're not supposed to do that. We're supposed to go all the way. But it just on the materialism. The short version is, I don't think it can be materialism all the way down. Right? Because if you do materialism all the way down, then you don't have a tool with which to capture how people who are trans have something, they are right, and the theory is how to capture it.
I think you do, but we can discuss.
Yeah, we can. So I believe more in a phenomenology there, but that is involving what Kant's move is, which would be the matter, is a vital force. So you realize your animality in tune with what he would call a natural vital force. And that would be the material element. But in my view, the mind and how it experiences its vital force becomes constitutive of how you get yourself right. Anyway, back to intersectionality. So part of what I did, just like we've kind of illustrated now, actually, which was nice, part of what I did when I wanted to try and do this with sex, love, and gender is to not do what Kant does, and what is very common in academia to do, which is that you start with your theories, and in Kant's world, it's the freedom theories, and then you work your way down to human life, right? So you get sort of down to human beings, not just rational beings, down to human beings, and then you work your way all the way down to particular historical societies, yes? And I think that he did that as a matter of sort of stream of consciousness, is how it kind of worked. I think that we shouldn't do that. So I do think we should do the freedom stuff, but once you want to go down to the human beings and to particular human beings, to borrow from the formulations just used, you first have to listen for a long time to what the life is that you're trying to capture with your theory. So you have to sort of switch at that point and try and do it bottom up. Are you with me? And he didn't. So that's the first thing you have to do. Philosophers, if we want to talk about actual stuff in the world or human life, first we have to listen. And then the second challenge is relating also to how to make sure that we, as philosophers then, who do we listen to as philosophers? In certain sense, we listen to everyone, but I do think, at least as a stage in this project, it's useful to listen to those philosophical minds that left us resources with which to think about exactly the issues we are trying to understand. Yes? So, for example, just like Crenshaw did, she went back and she listened to the black women, and now she had a problem, right? A legal case. And she would be like, what did you say about this? And there it was. And I'm thinking we should do that for a while now. We should try and get history of philosophy up to where it should be, and where one thing, and then getting our theories up to that. And to do that, we have to then read the people who were typically denied access to academia, let alone philosophy, or nobody's been reading them. And so that's my suggestion, what I'm trying to do in this paper, is to give the people who had distinctly philosophical minds and who left us behind their thoughts on what life under the oppression they knew, what it looks like, what kinds of theories they left behind for us. And that's a good starting point, I think, once we try to get our reconsidered, for me, Kantian theory of intersectionality. And so who are the ones I am listening or thinking a lot about at the moment? So you can see how I try to do some to give these thinkers a voice in my paper, right? But here are some, for me, distinctly philosophical minds who left either in having done the impossible of living their lives, or they left behind texts or thoughts or theories that I think are extremely useful as we're trying to develop our theory of reconsidered theories of intersectionality. And so who are these people? Queen Christina, if you have ever read about when Descartes died, Queen Christina is the one who invited Descartes to come to Sweden, and he died while he was there. That's probably all you know about Queen Christina. Am I right about that? If you know anything. You know that there was a queen that he went to visit, and then he had to get up early in the morning, and then he died because he couldn't get up early in the morning. Is that roughly?
Well, he corresponded with Elizabeth the Blind.
Yes, right. But if you know anything about her, you know that he visited her when he died. Now, she is actually a fantastically interesting woman. I don't have time to say much about her, but she certainly was one of those brilliant philosophical, those weird kids, you know, who just have a super, super nerdy mind, just like all of you, since you are here now at 10 to 6 on I don't know which day it is today, but here you are, and you're kind of high thinking about theory, so you had a mind like hers, otherwise you wouldn't be here right now. Anyway, she was brought up by her father, given the same education the boys would get, She was the single kid, and he made it the case that she inherited the throne. She, knew almost as many languages as your new professor here, 7, by the age of 7. And she just was really, really interesting. And she transformed the court in Sweden into this incredible haven for art and thinkers of Europe. So Descartes was one of the many she invited to the Swedish court to inform and enlighten people about what was going on in terms of theory and science. Now, within 10 years, though, of her taking the throne, she abdicated. She adopted her cousin, who was madly in love with her, but she adopted him so that he could inherit the throne. She thought he would do much better than she did, and that was true. She had very little support, and she certainly was LGBTQIA somewhere. Controversy exactly where. And then she got 1/3 of the wealth of Sweden as she abdicated, and she left for Rome, where she lived, and where she also established an academy, a free space for thinkers and artists, and protected Jewish people in Rome. Amazing art collection, many, many things. She's one of 3 women who were given the full honors of a burial in Rome. Oh gosh, now I've forgotten the name. What's the name of the main house? The Pope lives there. The Vatican, yes. So she's given that. And so if you go into the big church, what's it called again? Yes, St. Peter's. So you go in there and you turn right. There's a very famous Michelangelo statue there. So you can go and look at that one, and then you turn around, and there she is. And so she is an incredible, incredible woman. All of them have amazing stories about what they did. They all were distinctly philosophical, in my view, in how they thought. And many of them left theories behind for us. They all have some identity, one or more, that made it the case that they couldn't in any easy way be accepted into academia, let alone into philosophy. As you know, philosophy is one of the most oppressive places in academia. We compete, I believe, with mathematics or something. It's one of those places that are just not open yet. But fortunately, philosophers, we are so deep in wise, so we don't have a problem with that. Yes, yes, yes. Okay. So what are the kinds of lessons then? I think I'm doing a sketchy version of this, but what kinds of things do you find with them? But also, what kinds of things I think are true statements about people who live with oppression? This is not an exhaustive list, but I think that all of the things that I'm saying now are the case, that people who know oppression, and they will say, yes, that is true. The people who oppress, including us, if we oppress, we would typically have been grown up with at least thinking that that's not true about us. All right? Are you with me so far? So I'm going to just read to you these statements. And then I'm going to say to you, I think a good theory of intersectionality has to be able to explain all of this philosophically. That's the aim. Okay? So, all oppressed groups face forces that strive for the perpetual denial of equal public standing with non-oppressed groups. All oppressed groups face forces that strive to deny them a sense of home in the world, safety in their own bodies, beauty in their social presentation to the world, and economic independence. So, what also follows from that is that violence aims of all these groups often then aims at their animality, which is their embodiment. We are, after all, human animals. Okay? Also involving followed by shaming or disempowering activities in social and public spaces. I think this is true. Okay? Let me hint, I'm going to go back to some of the more technical stuff and just interrupt if you want to. But if you have a theory, say a freedom theory of Kant, yes, that has only freedom, or however you want to do it, you already have not what you need. because it involves animality, it involves sociality, embodied sociality. So you can't just do the work. I have a theory of intersectionality if all you have is the freedom moves in Kantian theories. Yeah.
As I'm understanding, you're saying that we need to listen to all these groups that are being oppressed, but I find it a little problematic because there's this chance that we might never, the voice that we should hear might never be over, because there's this problem that there's the possibility that there will always be a group of oppressed people. Mm-hmm. So is there this belief that at some point in history there will be no more oppressed people, or does this imply that we should always be listening, and so therefore we can't, as you just said, bring the theory down, because there will always be this, ¿cómo se dirá disidencias? Bueno, so this dissidences, you know, and so it's never ending.
Yes.
So how do we respond to this problem that there's never ending?
I do believe it's never ending. I mean, it's a hypothesis of mine. I don't think it will ever end. And I think if the theory of human evil, what it is that we do when we do bad things, I don't think a convincing theory is going to say, and then it was over. And as Professor Lutz was me, it's one of my criticisms of Marx too. I think he has a notion that at some point we're going to sort of come to a stage where we don't need rights anymore, or things like that. I don't think that's true. It's not going to be like that. It's going to be new things, in all likelihood, because of the natures we have. I'd love to be wrong about that, but for now, at least, I don't think so. It's also one reason I think why it's important to have, once we move into human earthly life, it's important to remember it's contingent. It's contingent both in that it's relative to the kinds of beings we are, and it's contingent in that it is involving a particular historical society. And it's going to keep changing. So I agree, and important. But I'm wondering still, sneaking us ahead a little bit, that some of the theories they've left behind us, and this is controversial, some people want to have various kinds of critiques that are contingent all the way down. They don't believe that we should also develop general theories, and I don't agree with that, right? I believe that it's possible and useful, whether it's my work on sex and love or now intersectionality, to also pay attention to the general theories that those who've gone before us left behind for us, right? They leave us the best they had, right? That's the general attitude. And what was that? And then we can use it. And I think some of those theories, we'd always have an open mind, maybe they will apply again. Because they might capture some general patterns of us, how we do it when we oppress, or what it is like when we are being oppressed. And so here's some of the theories that I find very useful for now, right? So that all oppressed people are made to feel like they are, or they should regard themselves with, or as, the other or the second in Beauvoir. Do you all know Beauvoir? Mm-hmm. Can you shake your head a bit if you don't? And then I'll explain it. Can you be honest? And just say, then I'm only one seeing it if you blink to me, right? You don't have to even move your head. I see your eyes, the others don't. Anyway, it is this notion that you're not the most important one. That your identity always is derivative of the most important one. So here's an easy and somewhat provocative way of thinking of that. You know the old version, like when you got married, then the woman should take the man's name? Okay. That's that, right? Now you're becoming fully you, and that means that your name is no longer yours. It's that of the man who has the most important name, the one that the woman should identify with, okay? This is Beauvoir, by the way. So it's this notion that you're not more important, or traveling the world with white privilege, right? It is that I matter always. And I can just assume that I always matter and should be treated with respect. And if not, I get very upset, right? That's this sort of white privilege. This is how it should be. And everybody else should just get that. So that's the notion that you treat it as the others, and you should treat yourself as the other. The woman should be caring about the entire world, and especially the men. Du Bois adds also something which I think is very interesting, which is that if you grow up with oppression, you grow up in a world in which the fact of you, who you are, is a problem. So if you're gay and grew up gay, hence I think it's a general theory, you know this thing. There's something wrong with you. It's very tedious to be around you because there's something wrong with you. I wish you weren't you. Because having you in the world is to have a problem in the world. And Du Bois speaks to that very beautifully with regard to how it is to grow up as black in America. Okay, it's in the US. That is just, there's something wrong with you. Having you around is to have a problem around. He also has another very beautiful way, which is very similar to this one in my view. These two types of theories are very similar, which is that if you have an oppressed identity and you walk out in the world, or you see yourself in the mirror, you always have a double awareness of how you experience yourself, but then also how your oppressors will. So a way to check that is whether or not you ever enter into a room and where your oppressed identity is evident, and then you check yourself, how you're presenting. Or you go out in the world, how do you need to present in the world to be safe? Yes? That's having a double consciousness. You're always aware of how the world, that is, the oppressive forces relate to you, and you have to navigate it and manage it all the time. I also find that one of Hannah Arendt's theories are very useful here, which is that if you are, which very, very many of you, I presume, in this room are breaking boundaries, you're entering spaces where traditionally those who had your identity were not permitted to enter.
Like this one.
Like this one, right? You have the temptation, you have the logic arising for you, which is pariah parvenu. She uses it with regard to Jewish men, and naturally, Jewish men were allowed into academia before Jewish women. And so one of the things she's thinking about there is how quite a lot of them were not loyal to Jewish people once they were allowed in. And she's like, why? Why? What is that all about? And in short, the logic is a bit like this. So if you are like me, a woman, LGBTQIA, and you enter into academia, and then you can all apply it to your own case, okay? And you then go to conferences, we go and talk to rooms like this one. It is very tempting to think of yourself in which way? Could anybody guess it? What's tempting to do? What's a tempting story I would like to tell about myself? How come I am here right now? And here you all are listening to me.
You're great and intelligent.
Exactly. I'm just so brilliant. So brilliant. So the reason why I have a PhD and you all listen to me is because I'm so brilliant. And if all women were as brilliant as me, or all women who loved women were as brilliant as me, they would also stand here. It's just that they're not. And that's why I'm standing here. Yes? So it's just that. And so, and part of what she's saying is that's the logic, because if you go, well, that's to be parvenu, shouldn't be an either, by the way. If you're parvenu, you are a token, but you believe, your story about yourself is that the reason why you were allowed in is because you're amazing. And then you are loyal to the oppressors instead. So you become the token friend or the token whatever. See, our department is not sexist. there's like 20% women here. Not sexist at all. We just only hire the best women. That's just why. We just haven't had really brilliant women come, except those two. And it's very tempting for you too to do it. And if you choose the other, which is for her the idea of the pariah, it's an outcast, then you're going to pay. Because that's going to determine how much you will be able to do. How many more doors you can go through. Or, which is the case still in academia, if you want to write on radical stuff, wait until after you have tenure. There's a reason why I didn't write my book before I had tenure. Right? I read classical Kant stuff, and then I did some hobby stuff on the sex, love, and stuff, gender stuff. And that's the logic with that, because in academia, it is the case that if you write the sex, love, and gender, then you can say that's not real philosophy. That's like philosophy light. Or philosophy race, that's that's anybody can do that stuff. It's just so easy. It's applied philosophy. Are you with me? So that's the logic. And so trying to be a pariah, and for her, of course, she was a pariah her whole life. Yeah?
Well, I read the paper, and I was thinking about how this logic pariah parvenu would apply to when you were talking about Queen Christina, and how she abdicated, or you talked about other examples of women who just knew when to step aside, when it wasn't just like possible to go on with their original plans, right? But I don't know how it would like match this logic.
So my hypothesis in the paper is something like this. All of these characters on that list, they've done the impossible. What they did should not be possible. Like, how do you do that? Like, no way. And then they did. And I believe that the reason why they were able to do it, they remained outcasts in important ways. But in my view, they were able to know which battles not to fight, when to just let it go. Because if you go that, then they got you. That's one way of saying it. They're going to crush you then. But if you step aside that one, and you keep your eyes on the target, you could get to the target. But don't let your emotional self get too tied up with any particular project. So, like Mary Ann Evans, right? George Eliot. She was also very much a philosopher. She translated Spinoza's Ethics. It's just now coming out, actually. And she published under an assumed name. She led a very unconventional life. She let go. She had translated the whole Ethics. And there was a fight between her man and the publisher, which made it the case that it wasn't published. And she just let go. Well, here, you let go of the crown. But I don't think you let go of the aim of living true to yourself. It's just you, in the Anna Cooper type of language, right? You're unbowed but bloody, right? You get beaten up a lot. But if you take the wrong fights, you don't stand a chance. So if she stayed in Sweden, I think that she would have been crushed. I think she was right. You have to leave. Or Anna Cooper, they came after her too, at her school, and that's at age 65 when she went to the Sorbonne to get her PhD. And then they realized, and then they came after her. And she tricked them again, and she got her PhD. But I think they have an incredible ability to judge when to let go and when to push. It's a hypothesis. But I don't think that makes you not true. You know, it's just that it's how much, when you show yourself, I think, in some ways, if you show what you're trying to do too easily to those whom you annoy by sheer existence, you give them a lot of power. And walking away is often central, I think. At least in these cases. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think it's like very Taoist.
Maybe.
Like choosing your battles and yeah. But yeah, I think it's clear.
But maybe that could be a way to develop that idea, right? The Taoism. Maybe. That's interesting. Going to keep that one with me to think about. Okay, so here's the other things. But please do just interrupt. I think people who know oppression will think that when it comes to intersectional oppression, it's exponentially more difficult. And I think they all have this, back to your question in a certain sense, but when you read their lives, you look at their lives and you say, so what did they do? I think these things are true. Proposal, I think they are true. Facing oppression, right, intersectional, then you have more than one social powerful group, of course. You also have the trouble of oppression from subsections within your own oppressed groups, your own groups, and yourself. There's a problem of betrayal, whether it's political, professional, social, personal. Sojourner Truth, for example, was betrayed by Frederick Douglass. Right? But it, you know, the examples are just enormous. I think economic independence is exponentially, the more intersectionality you got, the more it is the case that it's impossible to become economically dependent. So when you combine this one and that one.
So can you repeat that, please?
Yeah. So the more intersectional violence you have coming at you, the more I think is impossible to become economically independent. I think it's just, I think in academia in the US today you can have 2 oppressed identities, not 3. For example, you just won't get a job that you can live from if you have 3, statistically. Also, I think it's the case that if you have intersectional violence, and depending on a little bit on how it is, but you're only given bad options. So either this kind is called double binds, or that you have offers you can't reject, but they're bad offers. And then I think it is the case, and I'll see how much we'll talk about it, but because of the way in which the isms track pathologies, when they intersect, you not only get both of them, but you get new ones, right, like we talked about, and we'll come back to it, hopefully. I also believe, and this one topic we haven't talked about yet, and how this is developed. Part of what I want to do, and I think it's important, let's see what you think, now or later, you can always email me. I think it's important to also look at what they did well, in that, do they have any loving advice left behind about what they did or how they managed it? Is there something about what they did that is useful for people who live, us who come after them, to try and manage better? One of them is the walking away that we already talked about. But I think there are others too. I think it is true, for example, these are thinkers, so that might be it, but might not, is that they seem to have a very deep appreciation of solitude. There's a very, very beautiful paper written by one of the early white feminists on this, on solitude, but in general, they seem to have extraordinary deep appreciation of solitude. They often have clarified their deep existential or religious spiritual grounding, which means that, like Sojourner Truth, when she spoke in that room and she could have been killed, dying is not terrifying. They somehow know what they're all about, and they're fully aware that it could kill them. They tend to deal well with how once you're successful, the oppression becomes more obvious and violent. Like there's something counterintuitive. You think, there's lots of stories about this, but you would think that once you become more successful, whatever you're doing, then the amount of bad stuff coming at you is going to come down, but it is actually the opposite. And it's more blatant. They tend to have very few close friends. Not so strange, maybe. This is the module we mentioned. And they tend to have learned with how to deal with friends who are illoyal. I don't know of an exception to this rule, who haven't had truly important people who betray them. And you want your theory also to explain that. How come it is so tempting to be a bad friend to somebody who has several oppressed identities? Okay. And then we're going to sprint a little bit, if that's all right with you. I also think all of these things are true. I just want to get to the end, or at least have a little bit of that theory going for you. I think this is true. I think the people who know these will say yes, this is true. So, the violence coming at LGBTQIA plus and disabled people is to make them feel naturally perverted. I think it's true that the violence coming at women is to make them submissive, sexually caring means for straight men. The violence coming at gay men and trans people is annihilation through physical, sexualized torture. Lesbian women destroy their sexually loving ways and make them submissive to straight men. Bisexual live in accordance with straight or one type of sexually loving desires. Polyamorous make them live as monogamous. Queer and asexual people to make them feel immature. Intersex to make them feel personally deformed and make their physical embodiment conform with heteronormative bodies. Disabled people to regard themselves as think it's natural that they're being treated as research objects or test grounds for medical theories. Sex workers to make them view themselves as perverted or as desiring being treated as mere means. Religious minorities destroy their existential openness to the world as good by making life unbearably difficult, denying their religion is good, or to deny that they have a claim on a specific religion. Poor people to make them feel like they deserve to be poor and a mere means for others. Racialized minorities deny them equal intellectual standing with majorities and so make them mere economic or also for women sexual means for majority groups. Indigenous peoples destroy their relationship to their land and superior direct perceptive attunement to and understanding of the planet's forces. Black men tortured, sexualized public death. Black women reduction to purely private animalistic sexual means for white men and traditional woman ideal, and permissible outlet for anger and existential frustration for traumatized black men. So I think, in other words, if you want to go at this with Kantian, you have to have a theory that has moves, philosophical moves, with which you can speak to this type of complex stuff. What is it about our kinds of minds? Anybody have some water? You're right. That makes it possible for us to speak to it. How much energy do you have left?
Depends what sort of energy.
Yes. Enough energy for a little bit more? Okay. Because now it becomes super, super abstract, but a little bit more. Yeah?
I just, before continuing, I want to say, can you please turn back to the previous yeah, hold, just take a picture and...
Yes, absolutely.
Thank you.
Mm-mm. Okay, so now we're kind of, you see some of the complexity, right, that I think the theory has to try and talk to. And so, what is the theory? And you also know that I said, right, that I don't think you can do all of this stuff just with freedom moves. Whether it is, and in Kant, you know the freedom moves for Kant, there are two types of freedom theories for Kant is virtue, right? Which, if you've done a little bit of Kant, involves universalizing maxims and acting on perfect and imperfect duties. It's the whole thing about the categorical imperative, yes? It's not going to give you the moves here. Right? Just isn't. And then if you have done Kant's doctrine of right, his legal political philosophy, then you know correspondingly there's going to be the universal principle of right, innate right, private right, which becomes private law, and public right, which becomes public law. And you have certain moves, and they're all in terms of principles of freedom. So far so good? Maybe you know some of that. If you don't know all of it, it doesn't matter for now. But if you look at then a part of Kant's theory that very, very few people so far have really focused on, it is his account of human nature, right? Not just of what it is about our cognitive powers such that we can have freedom, but if you look at the whole theory of human nature, interestingly, what I've just talked about in some important way is just about this part here. About personality, which is how come we can be responsible beings, okay? And then about rational end setting, moral feeling is the odd. But ultimately, Kant's freedom theories is about this part here. And then you can see that's a little part of his whole account of human nature. You see it, right? And that's where the focus has been since he died, on this part here, which is amazing and revolutionary, and it was new, and not discrediting that. But it isn't the whole account. And the rest of it has, I think, some of the moves we need here. So let me try and I give you a hint of how that stuff works, okay? So according to Kant, we have human nature, like many in history of so-called Western philosophy, there's a tripartite theory of human nature. So if you have done your error soul, right, there's the rational soul, and then the sensomotoric soul, and then it's the vegetative soul. Yes? The thing missing here is which one? Or what I just said? One is gone. Yeah, the vegetative. Yep. Because the vegetative soul for Kant is not conscious in the relevant way. Okay? So it's out of his theory. This whole, it's all conscious being. One. Two, this one then is the part that in some important way we share with other animals. It's what makes us animals. And Kant thinks, as I read him, so I think the best way, and certainly the way I want to make the theory work, is that it's three conscious strives that constitutes our animality, and that these conscious strives is deeply informed with, as we talked about earlier, a natural vital force. So let me try and explain that to you, okay? In the best way and fastest way I know, which goes something like this. Imagine the newborn baby, okay? A newborn baby comes out, and there it is. Now, the newborn baby on this account is doing things, striving in certain ways, consciously striving in certain ways. What is it striving to do? What kinds of behaviors are there, or things we are looking at? Well, one of the things is that they're trying to survive. So you stimulate the sucking ability, but once you can figure it minimally out to suck, then they will start sucking and eating, right? How long will they eat for? Until they're full, right? And when they're full, then the natural vital force is harmonious. So they stop eating. What else do we do? Well, we touch newborn babies, right? A bit of Freud here helps you get this one, right? So we touch them, and that works. It's good for them to be touched a little, yes? It soothes them. It's important to be held. Again, it works well, harmoniously. Finally, we hold them tight, right? So we put them on our bodies and we give them a sense of being at one with you. Or it's basic community on this account, it's affectionate love. So we can feel at peace being at one with another human being. And so we carry the babies, newborn babies, around all the time. There's no so-called weaning with a newborn baby. The baby is awake, you pick it up, and you figure out eating, pooping, holding tight, being affectionately tended to, then they sleep again. And you repeat that every 4 hours. And that's what that is like. So far, so good?
Yeah.
And the aim is a harmonious natural vital force. Sleeps happy, wakes up, screams happy, you know, stuff like that. That's what you're looking for. So far, so good? Importantly then, this stuff and this part of the theory can be developed also with and is being developed with associative thought. It doesn't mean you don't need reflective cognitive powers. They don't have it yet, right? They can't think about things yet. All they can do is these things. But what you do see happening that quite fast is dissociative thought. So a certain smell, a certain sound makes them, good, stop screaming, right? Here the parents come, stop screaming. Associative thought, associating sounds with good stuff coming. Yes? This then stuff here is developed in this way, and one way to say it with technical philosophical term is that this type of self is reflexive. It's reflexive self-conscious anymore. It's the self-striving consciously, but it is not, beyond minimal stuff here, reflective yet. It's just minimally reflective with associative thought, to think about things. With me so far? Okay, that's this element. It is very important once we get to violence. So if any questions, ask them now. Okay? The other thing that human beings can do when they're already born, and in fact we also read that as a good thing, is that they scream. And Kant thinks, I think correctly, that that's philosophically significant. Other newborn animals don't scream. We scream when we are born, or if we don't, we are worried. Mm-hmm. It's a sign that things are all right. Mm-hmm. And I'm very, very good at delivering piglets. And believe me, they scream, but they only scream when they're hungry and they can smell food. They do not scream when they're born. They come out very peaceful, yeah, and just resting. Well, once they can smell the milk and everybody's, they scream just like newborn babies, human babies. Okay, so for Kant's explanation of that is that this is brute freedom. That scream is brute freedom, and is an expression of frustration because we can't act. We can't do anything yet. Short version of that, a giraffe takes maybe 30 minutes to get up on its long legs. It takes us about a year before we start trying to figure out how to do that. And Kant wants a theory that is able to explain that. Why is this so difficult for us? It couldn't be just because we have long legs or big heads or something. Social sense of self, this part of the theory, you can see for Kant, this is very Rousseau inspired if you've done some Rousseau, once the baby starts to smile and interact through smiling. Because once you can smile, according to Kant, it shows that you have an awareness of being seen by another. And Kant, contra Rousseau, thinks that this is originally a good thing. So when you have little parents and newborns and life is good and the parents have energy, there's a bit of a love fest going on there. You're happy, the other one is smiling at you, and then they get happier and happier, yeah? Pee is flying and, whatever, diapers, We're so happy, and that's that for Kant. The original good version of it. But agrees with Rousseau that it involves what enables us to have social emotions. Dangerous things, in other words. So it's linked to things like envy and jealousy, amour-propre, in Rousseau. Okay, but originally Kant thinks you can see it in baby behavior. It's originally a good thing. Good stuff so far? Last one, this one, personality is moral responsibility. And it takes us a very, very long time to develop. Because in order to be able to develop, we have to learn to act, And now I'm going to speak a little bit of Kantianese, but just stop me if you have to learn to act on a maxim, which means, for Kant, technical Kant, so when you learn to walk, you hold the baby like this, and you start saying, want to go to mommy, right? So let's go to mommy. And you keep on talking, let's go to mommy, let's go to mommy, there's mommy, let's go to mommy. And part of what you're trying with this, all this repeating, is to learn for the baby to put that end in the mind and then make the body behave in that way, which is to act on a maxim for Kant, to set an end of your own. And once you can do it quite well, okay, then I can walk to mommy, and then even if uncle comes into the room and say, look, Helga walks, I don't fall down. So I can be aware of what I'm doing and still do it without falling down, right? And with Kant, at some point, a speed version now, really a speed version, not only is this the case that the other one, the adult teaching me this is saying, Helga wants to walk to mommy, right? Not only that, but much later in life, at some point, I'm able to not answer only language or act in relation to language that uses my third personal name, Helga. But at some point, the little one is able to understand, do you want to go to mommy? So in Kantian philosophical language, this becomes that you have an I, that you can have reflective self-consciousness, and you can use abstract conceptual thought, use language to describe what you want to do as an I. Are you with me? So for a long time it's going to be Helga milk. Does Helga want milk? And at some point, do you want milk? And Helga will say yes, which shows for Kant that the little one now can do reflective self-consciousness and I, in addition to using abstract concepts to describe what you want. With me? Groundwork is all about that, right? How you can do that, and then with time, how you are able to think about the ends, the concepts, right? Whether or not those concepts are consistent with rational being. Can they be universalized? Is it the case that by setting this end, I am necessarily by doing the thing, what that concept means, making it impossible for somebody else to set their end, or not? If it is necessarily impossible for somebody else to set their end if I do what I want to do, then it's impermissible. You with me? I can't walk over another person, hit you. Why does my conscience say no if I can be morally responsible? Because then you can't set your ends. That's what it means. That end means that you can't be a rational end setter. You can't set your ends because here I come. Okay? So far so good? And so once we're able to do that, according to Kant, we can realize that I shouldn't do something just because it's wrong. I ought not to do it, which is moral feeling. So it's a special type of feeling, which is just, why shouldn't I do it? Because it's wrong. Good stuff? Are you with me? If you have all of these moves, now, let me do the speed version, first of all, before I talk about evil. If you have all of those moves, and you go back to all the lists we had of bad things we can do to others, it's not quite as accidental anymore. And what is not so accidental is, here's one way to say it, right? I want to set ends. I want to do what I want to do. One reason why we oppress others is to make them treat themselves as means to my end. Yes, it's convenient. Another one is I can feel important if others deem me as the most important thing. Are you with me? Mm-hmm. In other words, if you adore me like you were adored when you were a baby, right? If you walk around the world and you have a lot of people adoring you like that, it can make you feel very important. Yes? Okay. So there are some strong psychological reasons for beings like us that we want to, back to your question, will it ever end? I think probably not, right? To have these kinds of temptations in us. Put it differently, even if the little baby, right, has a tantrum, so annoyed, and can become an absolute monster, right? And a lot of that monster is that it wants all the attention all the time and wants to do whatever they want to do all the time. That's not going to go away, I think. And every human being has those challenges. Everybody starts from the beginning. But in addition, we create cultures where those patterns can, for material reasons, become quite important. Is there trouble? Okay, so, and then little last one, I think I'm talking you a bit to death now. It's also not so strange that the more vicious the oppression becomes, the more we use animality actively. Why? Because animality, in a fundamental sense, uses associative thought and is only reflexive. So the more violent the oppression, typically it involves animality. So if you remember up to all the LGBTQIA stuff, for example, women, often a lot of those forces aims at animality. Physical violence, sexual violence, attacking their way of being loving. And, well, my current theory is one reason why we do that is exactly because it has such an existential effect on us. It's so difficult to heal. Here's one way to say it. So if I get raped so that I know what the real thing feels like, right? That would be a type of rape that exists against women read as lesbians, right? You get raped so you know what the real thing is. So that can fundamentally deprive me of my sense of being safe in the world. It doesn't have to, it's contingent, but it can severely affect my ability to be sexual and open, and it can severely affect my ability to be intimate. And the reason why that is the case is, and that is true even if it is the case, that I correctly, like Susan Bryson in Aftermath, her brilliant philosophical engagement with sexual violence, fully know that I was wronged, and this should never have happened, and it was horrific, and the bad person gets punished and put in prison. The thing is that because it's associative, and because you've been terrified in this way, that you know that it was wrong is not enough to make it go away. It can be a smell, it can be a situation, it can be something, and it's all triggered. So I think that given the kinds of creatures we are, we intuitively know that this is a very, very dramatic place for us to be affected. Similarly, like we talked about, this is the embodied part, this becomes the social part. So oppression also then typically involves social shaming. And what is social, or ways in which is the fact that I'm being seen as I'm being seen is part of what the violence is tracking. So it's sort of continues to either be being denied or being shamed for who I am in that social space. And again, it's very disempowering. And I can't control how I'm being seen in the world. And that's part of what our minds use when we're doing bad things. Or what is also so difficult when it is being done to us is that we can't control it. So racism, for example, uses it all the time in how people are being cut off. So if you were in a traditional white philosophy space and you present an argument, what is mansplaining? Or white-splaining, you could call it. What is it? It's using this stuff, right? Why? And how? Because not until a man has said it, not until a white person says it, has it really been said. Right? Or heard, or thought as important. And so you use it, and you use all of them. So in order to get all the way to intersectionality, I also think, but I'd stop there, but I think you need also to pay a lot of attention to the propensity to evil, our propensity to do bad things, that we can do instances of it, frailty, we can do it as a pattern, or we can do it as a way of life. But most importantly, all of these tools that we've talked about, when I want to do bad things, I can use all of them in a creative way. If I understand these forces and pathologies, I know the principles, I know which buttons to push. When I want to do something bad, or have those desires, I can imagine new ways to combine them effectively. And that will be I think, impossible to eradicate temptation. And so why is intersectional violence so sort of exponentially much more powerful than one type of an ism? Because you have so many principles to work with. And how our mind is going to go about it is to be very imaginative with how we use them. We're using it all in various ways. Okay, now I can't talk anymore, so now it's up to you to talk.
I think we can. No? Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, so if I may ask. Yeah, so you briefly mentioned these two aspects of Kantian practical philosophy, the one from virtue and duty and the one with the concept of right.
Mm-hmm.
And ¿sí se escucha? Sí.
Sí, es para YouTube.
Digo, sí. So I was just wondering, and I also saw that you thanked Lucy Ale in your paper, so I was wondering if you agree with her in terms of the injustice at the level of right is another obstacle for us to achieve this personality level. I mean, if I am being, if I receive this intersectional violence, it will be more difficult for me to achieve this higher level of moral responsibility because there will be as many obstacles for me to do the right thing, just to do the right thing, because I know I am perhaps in a social danger of actually doing what's right. And I don't know if I'm making myself clear.
No, it's good. I think, so Lucy Alace is probably the paper you're thinking about. And is it the counter-racism paper?
Is the other one where in the Eric Watkins book, but I can't remember the title. But yeah, also the racist stuff about Kant and Charles Mills and Lucy's critic to Mills,
Yeah, so there's a lot in there. And so one way you can do it too is to relate it back to Crenshaw's paper. So another feature of that paper is that she also quotes another thinker who thinks that always when you do intersectionality, you kind of have to figure out who's at the bottom of the pile. So who's the most oppressed? Because the most oppressed, like it's like the people are a little bit less oppressed, they kind of stand on the shoulder of that person. And then there's another bunch of people on top of that. And so if you're down there, part of the challenge is to have a theory that can speak to how that person can possibly make it up to the top and climb through to that social power. And so one way to say, well, usually I agree with Lucy on very many of these things. Part of it is once you have the system put up in place, right? All of these things tend to be worked into the system itself. Right. I don't think, though, but I don't think she thinks that either, just to have said it, I don't think she thinks that moral responsibility is not possible. But it becomes a way in which you can't be free and you can't hold very many positions of responsibility because you're not, it's literally impossible to make it to that office.
So maybe it's just that it's more difficult for us to do the right thing. For example, if you live here in Mexico City and then there is this cop and you want to do the right thing because you know that the right thing to do is just to receive the ticket. So, but I know how this works here, and at the end of the day, it doesn't work. So I know it's easier for me to just give him money and not expose myself to the danger as, I don't know, as a woman, I am alone in my car and I know that it may be dangerous. So I know what's the right thing to do, but I'm not going to do it. And not because I don't want to do it, but because I know that where I live, it's more difficult. It's not impossible. I could always accept the ticket and say, well, I know I did wrong and I want to make what's right. But it's more difficult for me to be congruent? Yeah. Coherent with myself?
Yeah. Oh, right. Yeah.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Yes. So there are certainly at least two things to that. One is, on this type of position, and we never talked about it, but poverty is a systemic failure on this position. So it isn't really a problem that virtue is supposed to solve. So when you have poverty in this, it just means there isn't legal access to means for people who have no means, which means that the state is not minimally functioning. Because if it's minimally functioning, everybody has a right to freedom, which means that you can legally access means. And so when you have poverty in this system, is the only way to get to means is either by somebody giving it to you, but that's charity, that's not justice, or you commit a crime. So when you have a situation like that, and poverty is like that, then you don't have a minimally just system. And part of the trouble, in her beggar paper, for example, Lucy talks about also that's part of the problem with begging. Because the individual solution to it seems to be to give people money to people who need to beg. But they should never have to ask for money in the first place, and you're not solving it. You're solving something. You're giving money, and you should give money, but it isn't solving the problem. The problem is they should never be personally dependent on you in that way in the first place. So it's sort of you coming up in this impossible, everybody's caught in an impossible solution because the solution has to be systemic, and the system is not there. And so you are caught in these things. In addition, I think, too, another way of saying it too is something, it has to do with your question earlier. So when you live with oppression, you often will find yourself like with no good options. And so it doesn't matter what you do, whatever it is that you're doing is not a good thing to do. And then you deal. You have to deal with it, right? Here's a simple example. If you can pass, are you passing? Right? Or whatever it is. So the thing is that if you don't pass, then you're in trouble. If you do pass, you're doing something that you're letting yourself down in a certain sense. And so you end up with an incoherent self. And so whether you are from the oppressed point of view, the oppressor point of view, the thing is that you're inherently in contradiction. There's no harmony possible because what you're doing is one way or another wrong. And so one gets morally anxious and frustrated, and it's also obsessive. So it's hard to figure out how to do it. And temptations of deep self-deception also arises. Yeah?
Okay, I have two questions.
Yeah?
The first is general. It's about the intersection and the relationship with your theory of, or the Kantian theory or the Kantian anthropology. Mm-hmm. And the second is about the anthropological part of your presentation. And the first is I don't get the point of how this theory of human nature can be the material ground of an intersectional theory. I don't get the point, because sometimes in the intersectional theory is not about only the material in the sense and biological or anthropological, but culturally. And I don't see, and I work for a long time in anthropology, and I don't think Kant has really good resources to get a good account of culturally constructed experience. That is the general question. And the second question is about the anthropology. The way in which you present this kind of anthropology in Kant, I think, is closely related to the religion. But what if we see to the anthropology of the observation when Kant say a lot of things that we may, is a theory of humanity, but is sexism and is racism. So for example, when you choose the sex drive, Kant sometimes it's reproduction, and this is heteronormative. So in which sense you can make coherent this presentation in which in other sources Kant says a lot of things about human nature, you know, and it's about heterosexism, racism, and all the way down.
No, it's good. You're quite right. So this theory you find in the religion, which is probably also one reason why many never read it. Here's how I came to it concerning the anthropology. That start with the anthropology is like, it's one of the places where you find a lot of the horrific sexism and heterosexism. Not the only place, but it's one of them. And so one puzzle is, why is that where you find it, right? And also sometimes it comes in the Doctrine and Right? There's some of it there, not much. Once in a while it comes up as an example in the other places. And part of the puzzle was, why does it say it at all? Like, where does it come from? What does the stream of consciousness look like? And I found that if I just read the anthropology, there's no answer. Similarly to if you read the Doctrine and Right, there's no answer. What's the stream of consciousness? But if you use this theory, you can find out how it worked in his head. A lot of it. Not the racism stuff as such, but this stuff. Some of the racism, elements of it. And he had a speed version, something like this. One way to say what the philosophical mistake was is that he took this account. How does it work? Okay, a little bit more. Animality, according to Kant, is enabled by the three relational categories of the understanding used teleologically. Okay, so it's substance, causality, and community. And then you use it teleologically with regard to the natural end. And then you end up with his conservative view, right? So women and men have sex in order to preserve the species, and then they are affectionate beings since they create a unit in the home. And then that's how you do it. And then it feeds into his account of, in the anthropology, of how women have the social IQ, the men don't, why, etc. Why do the men go hunting? And so once you see that stuff in relation to the anthropology, you can see, okay, so that's how the mind worked. In my view, though, you also have what you need as a sort of a brute material in Kant if you want to fix it. Because in my view, when you're using the relational categories of the understanding teleologically with regard to earthly life on Kant's own philosophical system, that's contingent, right? And so I can argue, yeah, I want this stuff because it is the relational categories of the understanding, but it doesn't follow from it. The sexism doesn't follow from that. In fact, if you want to move to you have to take contingency seriously, and then you have to start look into human life and how they actually live. And then that has to be informing you for when you theorize, and Kant didn't. And so my solution is, yeah, I want all of these when I want to explain human sexuality. Because we use these, we use them to preserve ourselves as safe. It's part of what it is to sexually love somebody else, is in part that they make you feel safe in the world. Right? It's when they are there, that's part of what that phenomenology you want. It's good, I'm safe. You want it to be the case that this is someone with whom you are very turned on, if that's important to you. But some asexual don't feel that very much. They're not into it. So for me, it's like volume buttons, right? We are different. It's one of the ways in which you can explain many of the LGBTQIA. And basic community is the same. It's this sense in which that when you can be with somebody else, an affectionate love, that you feel completed in some important sense, and you feel affectionately open. So I think the moves are right, but you have to use it consistent with what that type of system should have argued from the beginning. One way to say it is Kant should have argued that. And part of the challenge is like, why didn't he? And I think that's also an important and interesting question. And then back to the anthropology, but once you have this stuff, and now we add up here, and here's where you find a lot of the culture in Kant's own head, but also in the Kantian theory, because we realize these things also on this social level. And Kant argues that, and this is actual Kant, not just sort of what I think he should argue. He thinks that these things, as drives in us, as desires, are very powerful. This initially is very weak. And he thinks that as we develop cultures, right, and culture for Kant has a lot to do exactly with that, we start with cultures as memories, he says. They look backwards. Whereas morally, we should have started there and down. But also as human beings, we start here and try and become there, rather than, in a certain sense, what we should do, here to there. And so we mistake what is possible for what was in the past. And so that's like the beginning of an answer to why I think it's much more interesting. And you can keep a lot of what he says, but you have to make the position contingent in the relevant way. And then suddenly you have moves, I think.
I think we have one question here.
Well, it's more of a comment, and it has a lot to do with my teacher's previous comments.
I see the power structures now, yeah.
Well, the other day I was talking with my friend here about how we don't like Kantian ethics because
there's a continuous line here.
I'm sorry, but I can now put it in like in even in Kantian terms, which is like more fun to do. And what we were saying is that we don't like them because, mainly because what my teacher was saying, that we don't, there are some social positions where you cannot do the right thing, or when it's more difficult to do the right thing. And so you're not only a problem in Du Bois' words, but you're also bad, and you cannot do like an moral action that has value. And so I was thinking that then there's like the violence also goes to personality, right? You cannot have a good moral feeling about yourself, because if you are only left with bad options, then you cannot do the right thing, and then you cannot be a good person. Like, you're not only a black poor woman, you're also bad. And I think that like psychologically it's like, well, really violent and really traumatic.
Right, so two pushes back against all three of you. It's something like this. I don't think Anna Cooper thought of herself as bad. So as a matter of lived experience, I don't think it's true. And it's not what she describes in Unbowed but Bloody. I really don't think she thought of herself as a bad human being. So I don't think it's the case. historically in those stories. Second, certainly there's something, there are two elements to it. One is something like this. I think it's wrong to judge if people can't hold on to themselves in that way and they give up hope. So one way to read Du Bois is that he did at the end of his life, right? And he changed his theory and it became black nationalism. And he had to leave the US and he gave up. And I think it's absolutely inappropriate to judge that. But in my view, it does mean that you gave up hope. And I don't think they all did. And not because their life was easier. And then perhaps two, I always wrote for the longest time from the point of view of LGBTQIA. And one way to say that, and certainly how I wanted to write the book, was to give a friend to those who live that life. If they like philosophy. Not if they don't. Many people don't like philosophy and they wouldn't pick up that book. But it's a friend. And to say that your life has value, and I know your life, I live that life, and to recognize it in a book. Because a lot of people who live LGBTQIA can never say that they are, or they will be killed. Or they can find themselves in families and societies where if they did say it, they would be killed. So, I wanted a theory that can speak to the individual in a way that isn't, we've had this discussion now for 2 days, 1 day, I don't know, very long time.
Yesterday.
Since yesterday. I think many theories that want to do a lot with culture, or construction for that matter, they can't get LGBTQIA life experience into view in the right way, and I wanted to have it. And I don't know any theory that can do it better. Does not mean that I think everybody should be Kantian, but it has helped me. And so I work with that theory because it does seem to be able to speak to the individual LGBTQIA. So here's the story, and I'm sorry for repeating it to two of you, but it goes something like this. This fall, a friend of mine passed away, and we went for walks and talked philosophy because we love to talk philosophy together. And this was our last conversation, and it was after very many hours of talking philosophy. He's at heart a Hegelian, which is a community type philosopher. And I'm a Kantian, and we like each other very much. Right? Right. But our heart was in a different place. And so the hypothesis we had, which we were going to continue in the next walk, but it didn't happen, we didn't know that at the time, was the hypothesis is that I'm a Kantian because I come from a life experience of being LGBTQIA. And he is a Hegelian at heart because he's Jewish. If you're Jewish, you have been persecuted as an ethnic group, ethnic religious group always. It's it's your parents, your grandparents, it's history. If you're LGBTQIA, and now I'm borrowing a concept from a trans person in Norway, you are like an original people without land. You exist everywhere, but you start fundamentally as a singular. And so, I always needed a philosophical home that speaks to the singular, because that's where I started. Whereas his heart was with the community, because he's Jewish and straight. And so sometimes I find where we find the place we need to be to live the life we live could be contingent in that way. So it's not an accident that a straight Jewish guy, and he was, we have to talk about that. So that was going to be a continuous discussion. It could be the case that sometimes what we need is going to be in different types of philosophies for those reasons that are so old that we don't remember their beginning. So that's what we look for. And so in a certain sense, I am happy for everyone not to be a Kantian. But I am, and I needed it. And so I am not universalist about that.
I think we can finish with that. Thank you very much.
Oh, thank you very much. And if you have thoughts and you didn't feel like speaking up, please do find me. I'm the only Helga philosopher.